These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? White has three pieces to work with in trying for mate: a rook on the open h-file, a queen aimed at f8, and a knight on f5, which among other things can be played to e7, suggesting the possibility of Anastasia's mate, especially since he already has the other half of the pattern, the rook, in place for it. The problem is that knight moves to e7 isn't yet effective. Black's rook guards e7, and f8 is open to black's king as a flight square. When you are this close to mating with your knight and rook, however, realize that your queen may be expendable and best used to clear obstacles from your path, even if this means giving the piece away. Think about queen checks and their consequences. White's 1. Queen moves to f8, check. Can be met in two ways. A. Black can play king takes queen. Now look for white's next possible check and you find only one: rook moves to h8, checkmate. B. Or black can reply to queen moves to f8, check. With rook takes queen. But now both obstacles to Anastasia's mate have been removed. It's safe for white to play knight moves to e7, and the king has no flight squares, so it's mate. White to move. What is the best move? White's winning sequence here ties together our present theme with the forks and discoveries studied earlier. We will spend 2 frames on it. White is confronted with serious trouble, a threat of mate on h2. The best defense is a good offense. He wants to go after black's king. When you undertake such an attack, you want to be conscious of nearby mating patterns, but also of any other patterns nearby, such as possible forks that might become possible if the king moves. Those thoughts run in the background while you experiment with a check: rook moves to e8, check. Black has 2 possible replies: king moves to h7 or the interposition bishop moves to f8. King moves to h7 puts the king in line with the loose rook on c2, and so allows white to win the rook with the fork queen moves to d3, check. It's an easy point if you remember to notice any loose pieces on the board. That actually is black's best option. To see why, let's assume black instead plays 1. Black bishop moves to f8. Now white continues with his checks: rook takes bishop, check. Again black must choose, this time between moving his king to h7 or g7 or playing king takes rook. If he plays king moves to g7, White can start an attack that eventually leads to mate with knight moves to e8, check. But since that is hard to see, you might instead just observe that white can play the fork rook takes at f7, check. Where his rook attacks black's king and queen with protection from the knight on d6. Black has to play queen takes rook, then lose his queen to knight takes queen. b. If black instead replies to rook takes bishop, check. With king moves to h7, white again has the fork rook takes at f7, check. Or, again, a longer forced mate, but we are focusing for now on forks. c. So assume black instead replies to rook takes bishop, check. With king takes rook, and read on. White to move. What is the best move? By stepping onto f8, black's king has just completed the three-piece kernel of a discovered check for white. The question is what white should do with his knight. The first choice is to use it as an aid to mate, but is mate within reach? Indeed, it is close by. White plays knight moves to f5, check. Which seems to take the knight far from black's king but seals off e7 and g7, trapping the king on its back rank and preparing for a form of Anastasia's mate. In reply to the check from white's queen, the king has to move. It is futile for black to interpose his queen on d6. If the king goes to e8, white mates immediately with knight moves to g7. See how the rook on d1 plays a key role in sealing off the d-file. If the king instead goes to g8, white plays queen moves to f8, check. This pretty much requires king takes queen, dragging the king back to f8 and away from any possible flight square on the h-file. White then clinches the mate on the back rank with rook moves to d8, checkmate. If you are at a level of play where these materials are helpful, the sequence illustrated in these last two diagrams probably will have been challenging. It is worth playing over until it is clear. Again, the actual payoff if the whole thing is seen by your opponent will be something less than mate. Black will subject himself to one of those forks rather than the mate that comes if he avoids them. Black to move. What is the best move? The Arabian mate. The Arabian mate dates back to at least the 1400s and probably much earlier. The three pieces involved in it have moved the same way since well before that time. The mate, pictured here in skeletal fashion, works equally well if white's rook is on g8 rather than h7. Either way, the rook takes care of the squares on the long diagonal while the knight covers the king's flight squares of the opposite color. The signature of the pattern is a diagonal relationship between your knight and your opponent's king, with or without an empty square between them. Then a heavy piece is added to one of the squares your knight covers. Black to move. What is the best move? The Arabian pattern also can be executed away from the side of the board, or with the rook underneath the king, or with the knight flush against it, all shown here. The point is to take advantage of the complementary relationship between a knight and rook. The knight protects the rook, the knight also covers a pair of squares the rook can't guard, h7 and g8 in this case, while the rook covers squares of a color the knight can't reach, f8, h8, and g7. In this frame the pawn on g5 chips in as well. Notice again the diagonal relationship between white's knight and black's king, a signal to try to get a heavy piece onto a square the knight protects, as white has done here. White to move. What is the best move? Now for a look at some ways the Arabian mating pattern can come into existence. The most common square for white's knight in this pattern usually is f6, or, for black, the equivalent square, f3. When the circumstances are right, the knight's move to that square itself can push the king onto h8 and in position to be mated. In this case white thus plays knight moves to f6, check. Black is forced to reply king moves to h8 since the g-file is off limits to his king. White then mates with rook takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? When you have a knight in the king's vicinity, make a point of thinking about whether and how it might participate in a mating idea. In this case the important clue to the position again is the knight's position on f6, diagonal to the black king. This is a signature position for the Arabian mate, which will be complete if white can get a heavy piece onto either of the squares the knight attacks next to the king, h7 or g8. White has a queen and rook available on adjacent files. How to proceed? Perhaps you can sacrifice one of your heavy pieces in a way that allows the other to reach a mating square. Experiment with both possibilities. One rook takes rook, king takes rook isn't optimal, it gives the king too much room to run. One queen takes at h7, check. However, is direct and effective. It requires black to play rook takes queen, and then the path is clear for white to play rook moves to g8, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Here white's immediate prospects for mate may look dim at first glance. Of course he can check on the back rank with rook moves to e8, but then the king has unguarded flight squares on h7 and especially f7, and then f6, etc. But observe that moving the king to either f7 or h7 will place it in a diagonal relationship to white's knight. This signals the possibility of the Arabian mate if white can give check with a heavy piece on a square next to the king that the knight protects, as he then can with rook moves to f8, checkmate. Or rook moves to h8, checkmate. Depending which way black's king has fled. Notice the side features needed to make the idea work here: protection for the knight, and a pawn on g7 to constrain the king's range of motion. Without those elements the mate fails. The pawn on h6, on the other hand, is unnecessary. White to move. What is the best move? We know from our work on Anastasia's mate that the f5 and d5 squares, among others, can be strong positions for a knight because from there it can jump to e7. Now you can see that e4 and g4 also can be strong positions because from there a knight can jump to f6, a classic post on which it can help execute the Arabian mate. Of course the f6 square has to be safe and other conditions must be met as well. Which squares really are best for your knight naturally depends on how the rest of the board is configured. Anyhow, here you observe that f6 is open for the knight, that knight moves to f6 will force the king to h8, that this will create the diagonal knight and king kernel of the Arabian mating pattern, and that then you have a rook on c7 ready to jump to h7 and mate, except that h7 is protected by the bishop on g6. The remedy is simple: a capture of the guard with one queen takes bishop, check. Requiring the reply pawn from h7 takes queen. Now the mate plays itself. Two knight moves to f6, check. King moves to h8, 3. Rook moves to h7, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Examine the white king's position and the black pieces that can be used against it. You have two rooks and a knight and therefore are looking for a way to coordinate two of those pieces in a mating crossfire. There is no way to mate just with the rooks. Experiment and see for yourself, so look for a way to involve your knight. From its current post on h4 the knight can reach f3 and this signals the possibility of an Arabian mate. Indeed, if you did not have a rook already on f3 this position would be structurally the same as one of the skeletal positions we saw a few moments ago. Knight moves to f3, check. Would push white's king to h1, then you would mate with rook takes rook. So what should be done with the rook now on f3? You really just want it gone, but moving it away without check loses the initiative and allows white to escape the mate threat. You therefore get rid of it with checks. 1. Rook moves to f2, check. 2. King moves to h1, if black instead interposes with rook moves to g2, then white mates with rook on from g8 takes rook, check. Followed by rook moves to f1, checkmate. Rook moves to h2, check. 3. King takes rook. The resulting position looks the same as the one pictured except that the f3 rook is off the board. By working solely with checks you have stayed in control of the action, and the nifty sacrifice at the end brings the king back to h2 so that now it can be checked again with knight moves to f3, check. Giving check with this move is critical, and was part of the point of what went before. After the first black move described a moment ago, rook moves to f2, check, the rook had been cleared from f3, which was one of your goals, but this wasn't enough because your next move, knight moves to f3, would not then have been a check, and white could have played rook takes rook g8+. With white's king forced back onto h2 the position becomes easy. 3. Knight moves to f3, check. 4. King moves to h1, rook takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? The position of black's king looks naughty, but this shouldn't cause you to overlook the fact that white, despite facing a mate threat from black, has half of an Arabian mate in place. Black's king is on the next diagonal square from white's knight, and the knight is protected, and h6 is sealed off as a flight square by the pawn on g5. If white could get a heavy piece onto g8, he would mate. That doesn't seem feasible, but perhaps you can make it so. It's an idea that can motivate your experiments. White has two heavy pieces at hand, his queen and his rook. This is more than he needs to finish the pattern, so the queen can be sacrificed if necessary. What happens if he starts with queen takes rook, check? King takes queen is the forced response. Since the knight on f6 guards e8 as well as g8, white can now safely play rook moves to e8, check. Forcing black's king back to g7, its original square. And now that the rook once on f8 is off the board, white has rook moves to g8, checkmate. Notice the rough similarities between this position and the previous one. White sees the knight and king kernel that suggests a possible Arabian mate. One of his own pieces here, his queen is in his own way, so he sacrifices it with check. Then he plays another check to push the king back to its original square, then at last comes the completed mate. This idea of pushing and pulling the king, with checks and perhaps with sacrifices, is a useful way to get a heavy piece where you want it while keeping the key elements of the pattern intact. White to move. What is the best move? At first this position is unlikely to stir thoughts of the Arabian mate. White's knight isn't on f6 and the king isn't diagonal to it. The key point to see, though, is that it quickly could become an Arabian mating pattern if black's king could be forced onto f7 or h7 by a heavy white piece, a, dropped onto the back rank to force the king to one of those squares, and then, b, moved to f8 or h8 to complete the mate. Hopefully you would see this much for yourself by now and finish the mate easily if black's queen were off the board. But instead the queen currently guards the back rank and meets rook moves to e8 with queen takes rook, apparently spoiling the pattern. Everything depends on how you think about this obstacle. The temptation is to conclude that there's no usable mating idea here because black's queen is so well placed. The winning train of thought turns that point around because black's queen is separating you from mate. It is stuck on the back rank and you can attack it with an unusual sense of comfort. How? Hit it with a fork. One queen moves to b3, check. If black plays queen takes queen, his queen has abandoned its defensive responsibilities and white has too. Rook moves to e8, check. King moves to f7, 3. Rook moves to f8, checkmate. It seems surprising that black's king has no flight squares, but there it is. If black instead replies to queen moves to b3, check. By moving his king, white has queen takes queen, and if black then thinks about rook moves to h2, check. In an effort to create trouble with his rooks, white has queen takes rook. Really this all is an application of principles we considered in the section on removing the guard. If an enemy piece prevents you from mating, think of it as a target that may be especially vulnerable. This idea naturally becomes more potent as you learn more different ways to threaten mate. In this case white wins material if he recognizes that one of the checks he can give, rook moves to e8, check, is a mating threat. The key to realizing this is a knowledge of the Arabian mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Blackburn's mate and kindred spirits. We have seen that a knight and bishop, or knight and rook, can create pressures similar to what a bishop and rook can create. Sometimes a pair of bishops can be enough to do the job, too. Consider the position to the left, where black is mated. White has a bishop controlling the long diagonal and bearing down on h8. The king's only flight square is g8. We know that it can be sealed off by putting a heavy piece on the g-file if the file is open, that is Morphy's mate. We also know that a knight on h6 can get it done. Now add another method to the catalog, a bishop aimed at g8 once the f-pawn has stepped forward. In a sense this mating idea combines Morphy's mate with Greco's, since the first uses a bishop attack against h8 and the second uses a bishop attack against g8. White to move. What is the best move? As usual, a sacrifice typically will be needed to create the conditions for the pattern. The queen often is the ideal tool for the purpose because it can make threats of its own so great that the offer to sacrifice it cannot be turned down, or rather it's made either way. In this case black has two pawns cluttering the long diagonal, which at first glance look demoralizing. But white wipes them out with queen takes at f6, this creates a battery on the long diagonal and threatens mate with queen takes at g7. Black may feel obliged to play pawn from g7 takes queen, the provocation of which was white's purpose, for now he has bishop takes at f6, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? In the last two diagrams the black pawn on h7 played an important role, taking away a crucial flight square for black's king. If h7 is open, merely hitting h8 and g8 with bishops won't work, the king escapes. But then there is the alternative pictured here where black again is mated. As before, white's dark squared bishop has a clean shot at h8. This time g8 again is sealed off by the light squared bishop, but from a different angle, and h7 in turn is sealed off by a knight from g5, which also protects the bishop. The absence of pawns in front of the king gives it more flight squares and so requires three pieces to mate. The general point, enemy flight squares require extra pieces. This position is known as Blackburn's mate, after the same player we encountered earlier in the chapter in the excerpt from the game Blackburn-Schwartz. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a typical sacrifice to bring about Blackburn's mate. White has control over the long diagonal and a knight on g5. He can't open the g-file for a heavy piece, Morphy's mate, and he can't get a heavy piece down onto h8, our first theme in this chapter, associated with Anderson. But there is another way to take advantage of the c3 bishop's powers, and that is to get the light-squared bishop to h7. The g6 pawn must be pulled out of the way, so naturally white takes what it protects. One queen takes at h5, requiring pawn from g6 takes queen to avoid mate with queen moves to h7 or queen moves to h8, but now too. Bishop moves to h7 mates anyway. The signatures of the idea are the two bishops raking the king's position and the white knight stationed on g5. The dark squared bishop and the knight almost are enough by themselves to mate, only g8 is left open by them, which is why the king's bishop must be added. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a simple use of the two bishops to mate. Those are white's only pieces, so work toward arranging them to mate one by one. First comes bishop moves to e6, so that the light-squared bishop cuts off g8, now the king is highly vulnerable along the long dark diagonal. The move wasn't a check, but since white now threatens mate with bishop moves to d4, black's reply is forced. He must protect the d4 square by playing knight moves to b5. His own bishop on c6 is not going to be any help because it runs on the light squares. This move does prevent mate via bishop moves to d4, but now white just directs his bishop to a different square on the same diagonal by playing bishop moves to h2, preparing for bishop moves to e5, checkmate. Black's knight can't defend e5 fast enough to stop the mate. Notice, of course, the crucial roles played by the pawns on the h-file. Without them, black replies to white's first move by evacuating his king to h7 or g7. White to move. What is the best move? Here white has two bishops trained on the black king's position, he has a queen nearby, too. Look at captures you can make and their consequences. One of them is bishop takes at g6. Black can't ignore this, for now white is poised to mate with his queen on h7. So suppose black recaptures pawn from f7 takes bishop, and now look for any checks that have become available. Queen moves to e6 checkmate. A little lesson: in addition to being used in a sacrifice, the queen also can fill the same role usually assigned to one of the bishops in these mates, and one of the bishops can be used to make the sacrifice more normally offered by the queen. After 1. Bishop takes at g6, we have been assuming that black would play the recapture pawn from f7 takes bishop. But he also has another, better reply that must be noticed. 1. Knight moves to f6. If white now tries to renew his threat with bishop takes knight, it no longer works. Black plays pawn from f7 takes bishop and white no longer mates. When white plays his queen to e6, black's king can escape to h7 where his knight used to sit. And if white tries queen moves to h8, black's king escapes to f7. White's best procedure in this variation is 1. Bishop takes at g6, knight moves to f6, 2. Bishop moves to h7, check. King moves to g7, 3. Queen moves to g4, check. This produces the position diagrammed in the next frame with black about to move. Black to move. What is the best move? To repeat, we arrived at this position by 1. Bishop takes at g6, knight moves to f6, 2. Bishop moves to h7, check. King moves to g7, 3. Queen moves to g4, check. It's black's turn to move. He will lose his queen soon, can you see why? It's because white's queen will be able to check her way to f6 and threaten mate there, requiring black to sacrifice his queen to get rid of the bishop on e5. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. From the diagrammed position, black has to play either king takes bishop or king moves to h6. If he plays king moves to h8, white mates with queen moves to g8, notice that the f6 knight would be pinned. Black's most favorable line is 3. King moves to h6, 4. Queen moves to f4, check. Working with checks to control the situation, king takes bishop. If black starts with king takes bishop, he ends up here a move sooner, 5. Queen moves to f5, check. King moves to g8, 6. Queen takes knight, threatening mate, and now 6. Queen takes bishop to prevent it, 7. Queen takes queen follows, and white has a 1 game. White to move. What is the best move? The side of the two bishops both aimed at the king's position should be food for thought even if one of them is blocked. Here you see that the c4 bishop is obstructed by its own knight, which suggests the familiar possibility of a discovered attack, perhaps a discovered check or even a double check. What tools does white have at hand to push the position along? The crucial piece is the rook on g1, which is poised to be forfeited to the cause. Thus 1. Rook takes at g6, check. A classic rook sacrifice on the g-file intended to pry open one of the adjacent files when black recaptures. If black plays pawn from h7 takes rook, white mates in classic fashion with queen moves to h8. If black instead recaptures with pawn from f7 takes rook, he has opened the diagonal leading to g8, so now that double check with the knight works, Indeed, knight moves to e7 is mate. So long as the king is stuck on those two squares on the back rank, bishops running at those squares can finish it. The special power of the double check at the end of the sequence is that it prevents black from thwarting the mate with a capture or interposition. The double check requires the king to move, and it can't. White to move. What is the best move? The first thing to see is the b2 bishop's clear line of attack against h8. Then see the other bishop on b1 also aimed at the king's position. All the obstructions on the pawn from b1 moves to h7 diagonal look discouraging, but don't be deterred by them lightly, they might be removable, and with a knight on g5 the possibility is important to explore. If the bishop on b1 were on h7, the game would be over. So white goes to work with sacrifices to clear paths. First, one queen takes at h5, pawn from file g takes at h5, to prevent queen takes at h7, checkmate. The g6 pawn is out of the way, that leaves the knight on f5. Again white clears it by making a threat a check from a square the knight protects. 2 and pawn from g4 moves to h6, check. And pawn from f5 takes knight, again forced. Now only the pawn on h7 is left, so white takes it out with his mating move. 3 bishop takes at h7, checkmate. It's just another study in the methodical removal of obstacles to a mating pattern. Granted, all this merely is the sequence that results from natural recaptures by black. After white's original queen takes at h5, black also can play bishop takes knight, allowing queen takes bishop and thus sacrificing a piece to disrupt the mating threat. Black to move. What is the best move? The mating idea for black is concealed here. The clue that enables you to unravel the position is the rook on g8, not because it necessarily will help administer mate, but because it gives you a natural way to open the white king's pawn cover. If you have a way to take out the g2 pawn, as black does here, it calls for experimentation to see what patterns might result. The thinking starts 1. Rook takes at g2, check. Since the rook then has protection from the bishop on b7, it wouldn't even be a sacrifice. White would be forced to reply. King moves to h1. Now black has the kernel of a discovered check on the long diagonal. He could use it to go after white's queen with his rook, but focus on mate. Withdrawing the rook to g6 almost creates Morphe's mate, but not quite. White interposes his bishop on e4 and black's threat is extinguished. So the better route now is for black to consider his other resources and how he might involve them. He has two bishops aimed into the white king's corner and a knight available as well, signals that Blackburn's mate or some other bishop-driven pattern may be possible. If black could get his knight to g4, then both bishops would have open lines, and if the white king could be brought to h2, then black could move his knight to g4 not only with a discovered check but with double check. So black plays the ingenious 2. Rook moves to h2, check. Plus, if white moves his king to g1, black mates immediately with rook moves to h1, a heavy piece in the corner supported by a bishop. So white is forced to play king takes rook. We arrive at the position in the next frame. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's two rook moves have created this situation. Now comes the payoff, starting with 3. Knight moves to g4, check. Plus, since it is double check, white cannot capture and must instead move his king to g1, its only square. Everything is in place for the denouement. Bishop moves to h2, checkmate. The most valuable thing to study in this position is the arrangement of bishops and knight in black's position. Neither the dark squared bishop nor the knight are in the pattern for Blackburn's mate, but they are in a position to reach that pattern. They can be scrambled into place in 2 moves if the white king is forced to cooperate, which is where black's rook comes in. Go over the movements of the black knight and bishop in this diagram, and the prior one, until the pattern flows visually in your mind's eye. Black to move. What is the best move? Let's have another extended look at how Blackburn's mate can arise, this time from the game that gave the pattern its name. Blackburn, playing the black pieces, moved his knight to g4. This threatens mate via queen takes at h2 and therefore forces white to push his h-pawn to h3. Black doesn't move his knight, though. He keeps the initiative with bishop takes at f2, check. This seems to invite white to play rook takes bishop, but not really, for notice that with the knight on g4 the f2 square still is attacked twice. This means that if white plays rook takes bishop f2, black can reply queen takes rook f2 plus and force white's king to h1 and then mate with queen moves to f1. So instead white replies to bishop takes at f2 with king moves to h1. Now we reach the position in the next frame. Black to move. What is the best move? A mating pattern comes into view. The bishop on f2 seals off g1, and black's knight seals off h2, thus the dark squares around white's king all are accounted for, so an attack on the long diagonal would have lethal potential. The g2 pawn can be pulled off that diagonal with a simple queen sacrifice on h3. If black's light-squared bishop were available, the idea would be complete. Unfortunately it's way back on c8. But then you see that the bishop might be moved without a loss of time because it will unmask a discovered attack against white's queen. Thus black plays bishop moves to f5. This move puts white into deep trouble. His natural move indeed, his only move that does not lose his queen is queen takes rook. But then black mates in 2 strokes, queen takes at h3, check. Requiring white to reply pawn from g2 takes queen, and then bishop takes at e4, checkmate. This was how Blackburn in fact ended the game. White's better reply to bishop moves to f5 would be pawn from d2 moves to d3 or queen takes at h7, check. These moves lose white's queen but forestall mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Boden's mate. We continue with mating patterns that employ the 2 bishops. As shown in the diagram on the left, where black is mated, Boden's mate is similar to Blackburn's mate but moved and reversed a bit. Either way one bishop cuts off the king's flight squares while the other then stabs at it along a diagonal. And notice that in both mates the king must be prevented from retreating away from the scene of the crossfire. In Blackburn's mate this function is served by the side of the board because the king is on h8. In Boden's mate the function is served either by black's own pieces or by pieces of yours like white's rook on e1, which stops the king here from escaping onto the e-file. Black to move. What is the best move? We started in the prior frame with an example on the king side because that makes it easier to understand the relationship between Boden's mate and the others we have seen. But Boden's mate is more common when a player castles on the queen side as shown here. The reason is that after queenside castling the king is left 3 squares from the side of the board with the rook blocking d8, putting part of the pattern for Boden's mate already in place. Kingside castling leaves the king 2 squares from the edge, so it must be moved over for the pattern to work, and then the e-file has to be blocked off. It takes more time and effort, whereas in the pictured position white's bishops are able to achieve checkmate with no help from any other white pieces.